So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to another preview of the upcoming new patch. And this is going to be another one of those reworked, very well known maps as it was previously, because this is the new version of THRANDUILS Halls, and the old version of this is probably one of the most showed maps on my channel, so it's good to see that we finally got a little bit more fresh blood in the game in this regard. And its layout now, it actually reminds me a little bit more perhaps of the older version of THRANDUILS, with the two rivers either side of the central settlement here, which is going to mark the first defensive point, and that was not too dissimilar in the old one, where there was an outer defensive part and then the interior of THRANDUILS Halls itself as well, which has seen a very big overhaul, it must be said. The old version was very much just a square really, with a body of water in the middle, whereas now there is going to be a little bit more intrigue about how the attackers and defenders have to interact with the interior section of this map. It is worth saying as well, very quickly, that I was told by Eclipse that this one is essentially 95% done, so it's not completely done yet. I think in terms of its overall layout and look it is, but I think some of the mechanical elements, like there's some parts where there are like solid things that archers can shoot through. But I don't think, considering 95% was the descriptor, I don't think that's going to prove to be too relevant in terms of determining the outcome of this particular battle. So you can see the ELVENKINGS throne all the way up here, a little bit more indicative this of what the actual interior of THRANDUILS Halls you would imagine would look like. The town centre obviously down here. One real feature of this map as well is on the interior you have these sections on the walkway up to the throne itself where archers can stand, and also on the outer part of the settlement we have these elven walkways, which are also a feature in generic elven settlements as well. So good shooting positions, rather unsurprisingly for a faction like Mirkwood, is what their capital seems to prioritise, and of course the elves themselves, when they dig in on the defence, are very dependent on their archers doing an awful lot of damage. They've got a lot of skill in melee and can do a lot of damage in terms of one-to-one engagements, but one problem they often run into on the defence is their manpower tends to desert them pretty quickly if they're not able to keep that consistent damage at range and in melee up. And that will certainly be the case here, considering the attackers are going to be arriving in numbers here skulking out of Mirkwood itself. So we'll start off over here with Infinity as the first attacking army, playing as Rhun. Now Rhun, it must be said, probably not the most efficient faction against Mirkwood, purely because, again, armour piercing is really the thing which sets them apart. They are pretty much a jack of all trades faction in general anyway, one of the more well-rounded evil factions the game has to offer, but the extra armour piercing many of their units have is what really sends them over the edge in terms of being an efficient combatant. Not the most useful thing against Mirkwood, though they do have a few things that could be pretty good. The Carmel's Immortals will actually do reasonably in melee, considering their lower tier nature. The main problem, of course, is that they are pretty weak to archers, so in melee they'll sort of punch above their weight, but if they start getting mown down by those elven arrows, they're really going to struggle. Mirkwood, of course, don't have any phalanx units of their own. They're one of only two factions in the game to which this applies. So the Gamprim, in spite of the fact that normally it's the armour piercing on the end of their phalanx which really is, the thing which sets them apart, this time around it's just going to be the fact they're a phalanx unit at all. If they can get into a position where they can really pin Mirkwood down in a prolonged melee engagement, this is perhaps how Rhun can get some efficiency out of their infantry. Though, of course, again, the main problem for them will be they will be one of the first choices of targets for those deadly elven arrows, so we shall see. It's not too surprising to see the Flagrim are still here in greater numbers, however, in spite of the fact that, again, that armour piercing of theirs isn't going to be used to its fullest against Mirkwood. The main fact remains that they are still the most efficient line infantry unit that Rhun have in terms of their defensive abilities as well. Decent armour values, good shields. They're going to be able to withstand more of that range pressure than some of the other Easterling units that we have seen up until now. And this is also perhaps a battle where the Scion Rim here can shine most of all, because they're not going to do much damage to the elves, admittedly. They are a defensive unit by nature. But, the very heavy armour that they wear, as well as that the shield values that they do possess, means that they're going to be one of the better units for being able to withstand that elven pressure. And of course, over the long haul in this battle, more units like this are going to make it more difficult for Mirkwood to really be as efficient as they need to be if they're going to be victorious on the defence today. The Carmel Shadow Guard, again, armour piercing, is perhaps something which won't be quite as efficient as it would otherwise be, but the very high base attack values of units like this are still useful in this situation, especially if the Elven line starts to fall apart. If you can apply a unit like this at just the right time, you can really put the elves under a lot of pressure very quickly. Balgoth tribesmen, putting pressure on those defensive lines. I mean, javelins, again, the armor piercing may not be the most useful thing in the world, but the fact of the matter is they can do a good amount of damage pretty quickly for a relatively cheap unit. Again, cheap javelins like this have always been a little bit of a puzzle for defending factions to work out, especially quality and, you know, price intensive ones like Mirkwood, because if you use your arrows on them, the attackers would accept that, to be fair. It means that their more heavy hitting infantry is going to be free of that particular honour, and if you don't, the tribesmen are going to be able to do a good amount of damage anyway. One thing I think the elves are going to have to use their ammunition on, however, is going to be the strong crossbowmen, partly because the crossbows are not really going to be able to stay alive under that sort of pressure for any sort of length of time, really. But also, these strong crossbows can do a lot of damage in return, and on those elven walkways as well, they don't offer the most cover, so this is going to be one of the units which potentially the attackers can use to try and deny the elves that good defensive position that they will be hoping to use. And the Nar Rim, I mean, they can trade back and forth with the elves to a certain extent, but the terrain, the damage that the elves can kick out, it's not really going to be one-to-one anyway, the sort of skirmish fight that Rhun can win. But if you combine that with the other factions on the attack today also bringing their own archers, maybe things can be a little bit different. There's a lot of this siege equipment here which has just been strewn about the battlefield. Don't quite know who's going to be picking that up, but we have the Rhovanion, played by Mr. Sneakman, marching in step with their new Easterling overlords, it would seem. Rhovakin phalanx, potentially very useful unit in this battle, in fact, because they are shielded, so those elven arrows will be a little bit less effective against them. And of course, as pikes, it's an even more extreme phalanx example in comparison to the Gamp Rim, so if they can set themselves up nicely, Mirkwood are going to struggle a little bit again. Arrow fire and positioning is the way that you can deal with this kind of unit, so we'll see if Mirkwood are able to do that as the battle goes on. Tribal Berserkers, a good damage dealing unit again. The problem with most of the tribal units are going to have is their armor values are relatively non-existent, and the Berserkers are dangerous enough to the point where the elves will probably be targeting them first and foremost. And of course, the very highest tier of elven unit will do pretty well against the Berserkers anyway, so normally the be-all and end-all of the Rhovanion offensive effort on foot anyway may not be quite as effective as they would be under normal circumstances considering the opposition today, but I could be wrong. Rhovakin Hoplons, more defensive, and these more defensive units, as we mentioned with the Scion Rim, could be the key to victory here, just sort of managing to weather that Elven Arrow Storm and eventually overcoming with sheer numbers are a tried and tested method of beating such factions, of course, and the Hoplons can definitely contribute to that. The Tribal Levy Slingers, if they can get into range, they could be a potential nuisance for the elves to deal with as well, in the same way that the Balgoth tribesmen are. Different weapon choice, of course, but the same principle applies really. But again, these tribal units weak at range and also weak in melee if they are unfortunate enough to get caught out by those elven defenders. More hoplons, we've got more tribal berserkers, and we've got more pikes back here as well, looking like there may be a few hidden units here and there also. We also have the Rhovakin nobles here, which relatively straightforward as far as a bodyguard unit goes, but in terms of what they actually bring to the table in terms of survivability and dependability, might be a good choice here considering the elven opposition. There is Tribal Levy Spears, which is where his general is, so this does of course mean that these nobles can also be used a little bit more freely without fear of losing the general, because morale is one way in which attackers can scupper themselves here in this sort of situation. Meanwhile, over on this side of the field we have Sin of the Dark Cloud playing as Mordor, who have been pretty effective in most of the battles we've seen them so far. Not always victorious, but always difficult to deal with. Numbers, of course, going to be one pillar of their attack, with plenty of Orc fodder. The Troll Drummers here to keep them marching in the correct direction. Orc Javelins, possibly the best example of a cheap throwing projectile unit that can be a real pain if you don't do something about them. Of course, cavalry is the best way to do that, but it's very rare that the attackers will allow you to simply charge into such units without any sort of reprisal. Uruk Infantry and Blackguard of Barad-dûr here in high numbers as well, pushing through those defensive lines. Troll Catapult also, not too surprising. We've got the Olag High, so a troll-heavy presence once again. The elves in melee, to be fair, can whittle down even the Olag High more quickly than most other factions can, but the level of damage they can do on the way down is still something the elves will be worried about. Temple Executioners also, plenty more Orc fodder. I mean, to be fair, there is a bit more of an emphasis on these heavy-hitting, more monstrous units, especially when you consider the Beasts of Gorgoroth are here. They'll be more useful, I think, in the outer section of the settlement to really try and secure the outer settlement first and foremost. It'll be where they can manoeuvre a little bit more easily without getting caught, and we have seen monstrous units drop pretty quickly and also very recently, and that was the Mumakil, who are more sturdy individually than the Beasts of Gorgoroth, it must be said. The second runic army under the command of WK, more of the Flag Rim, same thing applies of course. I think it's going to be a very similar army honestly, with Gamp Rim, the sturdy Scion Rim, Carmel's Immortals for that cheaper unit, and also Balkoth Trident. Interesting as well, this is the first time we actually get to see the new unit model for the Dragon's Breath artillery. Mechanically it'll be interesting to see if there are any significant changes. I don't believe there are, but this is much more, it's not just the old Great Bombard model anymore, there's something a little bit more appropriate, shall we say, and they're manned by the impressive Dragon's Breath crew, and the Carmel's Chosen, who are not dissimilar really to the Rhovakin nobles on the other side of the field. And finally, another attacking army way over here, we have the Witch Realm of Angmar, commanded by Adin. We have plenty of Angmar Marauders, Angmar Halberds over here, we've got Orc Fellas, so armour piercing, obviously the Halberds, I mean the Gamp Rim are going to be more of a dependable halberdier to try and build an anchor around. The Angmar Halberds are really quite fragile, so if the elves can get in and amongst them, you'd imagine they crumble pretty quickly, but when you combine them with all these numbers it might be a little bit different. We of course have the Blackwatch Legion for that aggressive push as well. Barrow White's much slower burn of a unit then, but even the elves will struggle to chop them down quickly. More trolls will be a concern, obviously monstrous units in general are going to be something which the elves have to look out for. Troll catapults as well. We also have the Witchers. I mean the Witchers, a couple of good volleys from the Witchers, even in their slightly nerfed state as they are now, are still the sort of losses which the elves in particular can scarcely afford to sustain. And then of course we have the Witch Realm Hammer Guard, again the armour piercing, but wanting to go for the more aggressive bodyguard unit again, because the base damage is still so good, and ultimately the armour piercing isn't going completely to waste, it's just less efficient against the elves, and the elves in terms of equivalent units will have the ability to deal the damage in response. Now, 2 times over here playing as the first Mirkwood army, Woodland Realm Patrol, the standard Elven Archer of course in a good defensive position up here, maybe a little bit exposed, but the damage they're going to be able to chuck out as the attackers advance across the river is going to be key. For Mordor as well actually, considering a lot of their units are more monstrous in nature, they can be a little bit more weapons free perhaps and still be fairly effective. Maybe try and go after Rhun a little bit more. Woodland Realm Axemen will be very good against the rank and file of the Orcish factions in particular, and the tribal units and the Rhovanion. The standard units for Rhun, however, will be maybe more of a match for them in terms of the Immortals. Indeed, pretty much the same kind of unit, only one being slightly more numerous, one being slightly more quality heavy. Obvious way around that is. Several units of Woodland Realm Axemen over here, of course, to pad out those numbers, which having more numbers for the elves is key, of course. You don't want to just get crushed because you don't have enough to be able to man a front line effectively. The Elder Council, I mean, Javelins, we already mentioned how effective they could be for the attackers. The elves have to use theirs to their maximum as well. It's exactly the sort of unit which will be useful at trying to whittle down those monstrous units, and of course any bodyguard units which come forward early. The Entwives over here, interesting to see how they get on. Again, more of a monstrous unit, similar to the Trolls. I mean, this is something which Mirkwood do have in the back pocket. They may not have the ability to put on a standardised pike line, but they can be aggressive in a way that maybe would be surprising, considering it's a high-risk strategy for the elves, but that's the kind of unit which allows them to do that. Eclipse bringing them. Hiri Peng as well, sort of a slightly heavier archer unit, more well-rounded and better in melee than the Woodland Realm Patrol. More damage at range as well. Mirkwood Rangers, of course, the damage that Rangers can do is very well documented, and having this amount of them right from the start is going to be a potential concern for the Rhovanion coming across the river here. Mirkwood Silencers as well, more of an assassin class unit. This, again, if you can use their projectiles effectively and then worm them in behind enemy lines to cause some chaos, they can be pretty effective, but they do tend to fizzle out pretty quickly. That kind of unit, I think, mechanically is always going to be like that. Hiriak, probably the best defensive bulwark unit that Mirkwood have, at least that they can mass up. Big shield value, especially when you upgrade their armour as well. They can be pretty sturdy, but there's a lot of units that are going to be heading their way, and quite a lot of ground for only 2 units of spears to try and hold, but they do have a lot of support from the silencers and the rangers, I suppose. Palace Guard are here as well with some more Woodland Realm Patrol and some Hiri Lang. Obviously the Palace Guard, the very best of what Mirkwood can field in melee, and indeed nothing really that the attackers have one-to-one is as versatile or even as good in terms of fighting one-to-one as the Palace Guard here. I mean, situationally perhaps you could say the Executioners and the Hammer Guard might be more efficient in some, but obviously the Palace Guard, that versatility of theirs is what really sets them apart. Then in here we have Mevin, who is the other Mirkwood force. Elvenking's Guard, axes in melee, of course. Unlike the other way round, armour piercing for the defenders here, as much as Mirkwood don't have too much of it in melee, what they do have is going to be very, very handy, especially when it comes to cleaving through those orcs and the higher tier from the Rhovanion. Several units have upgraded Hiri Lang here as well, so lots of melee damage and range damage here. More Entwives, we have more Hiriak as well, so you can see this is where the great and the good of Mirkwood are. I think they're going to try and be as efficient as possible in the outer defence, more of a sacrificial part of their army that, and just try and do as much damage as possible, and then the primary part of the defence is likely to happen in here, where a lot of their elites seem to be stationed. Elder Council, more silencers. We also have some more Woodland Realm Axemen. You can see there's a surprising amount actually, and there is another way in over here, which is something else to consider. I mean, over on this side of the river, interestingly enough, it's going to be maybe a little bit more difficult for the attackers to gain momentum early, because there are of course only 2 armies over on this side, whereas there are 3 on the other side. But Mevin will be ready for them regardless, and indeed the Palace Guard ready immediately with their glaives. Woodland Realm Axemen also, silencers and Elder Council. Not too many surprises here in the Mirkwood lineup thus far. There is no such side entrance over on this side, I don't believe. Elder, again, more Palace Guard from 2 times. Elder Royal Council, of course, the highest tier archer Mirkwood have, Silverthorn arrows, which have always been more of an incidental thing, really. Very occasionally they can scupper the momentum of a pushing attacking army, but more often than not it doesn't really work out that way, but the base damage of them is still very, very significant anyway. Hiri Lang, Mirkwood Silencers and Elvenking's Guard as well, and as we previously noted, there are also these archer positions over here which are manned by more Elvenking's Guard, very appropriate considering the throne lies just beyond. But yes, no other way in. So 2 ways into the halls themselves. One, they have to go through the settlement itself. One, they can take a more direct route, but that leads right into the teeth of Mirkwood's most highly strung defence, shall we say. But I'll make a little bit of a cut, because I don't know how long they're going to wait for the Runic and Angmar armies to join up with the initial attacking forces. But yes, we will rejoin when, likely, the first arrows are being loosed, shall we? So just narrowly missed the first action there, which was actually by the attackers, the artillery flying over the fortifications and nearly hitting it, and with that the elves are also going to start opening up. Of course, not going after the first unit of orc fodder which is crossing the way, but will be going after some of the units which follow them in. I mean, going after the Carmel's Immortals is certainly not the worst idea in the world, because of how vulnerable they are to arrow fire and how surprisingly decent they are for the tier of unit in melee. Should be able to do decently in bulk against some of the more basic units of elves, like we've mentioned. Orc fodder on the way forwards, the Entwives lurking in the background as well. That artillery is a potential concern, but all of the defenders getting back into relative cover. Just keeping an eye on the minimap to see when the attack on the other side begins, but it's really more incumbent on the attackers to be more aggressive over on this side. Like I said, there's 3 armies over here. They are going to need to try and make use of the sheer weight of numbers that they have to try and work their way through this defensive position more quickly, especially seeing as they're being funneled into only 1 defensive point, whereas on the other side, probably would have been better off for the attackers if the 3 had been on the other side, so they could more evenly space themselves between attacking this outer settlement and trying to go directly into the halls via the side entrance. But that is not what's going to be happening. Woodland Realm Axemen just shuffling forward a little bit. Of course, they will be particularly effective against a unit like the Orc Fodder. Carmel's Immortals making their way forward as well. The Troll Drummers in the background, but they will just be hanging around near the fight as opposed to getting involved in it. At least here in these early stages, you won't want to be dumping all of your ammunition in like that. Mirkwood Rangers starting to fire immediately. I mean, these strong crossbowmen are moving forward, which Maybe it is a little bit surprising that they're the ones that are going to be taking point here, considering the elves won't really have to think twice about launching a volley or two into them. You want to be trying to deal with these crossbows as quickly as you possibly can, after all. Moving forward to maybe try and go after those infantry lines that the elves have laid on for the defenders over here. Meanwhile, over here pushing the ram up to the side entrance. Infinity sending his crossbows over there to help support the Rhovanion advance. Meanwhile, the vast bulk of his army going to be over here. It is only one sliver of the attacking army so far. I want to be a little bit careful with all this ammunition. Does 2 times. He doesn't want to dump too much of it too quickly. Using 1 unit at a time would probably be for the best, but still shooting into the backs of all of these units, so even the examples of some shielded infantry in here, like the Uruk infantry, is not going to have much in the way of defences applied. And Elder Council as well. This is a lot of ammunition that 2 times is dumping early. I mean, going to be doing a lot of damage, of course, and going to be comfortably able to hold on to the front lines for the time being, but we have seen several examples in the past, especially in 5v3s like this, of using too much ammunition too early. And then come the late game, they don't have the ability to blunt the attacker's final push. Elder Palace Guard from Eclipse moving in as well. Uruk infantry. I mean, as soon as I've seen that, said that to be fair, 2 times has eased up a little bit on the committal of such resources. Rhun moving in as well. I mean, there's certainly no danger of the attackers breaching this defensive position quickly, which could have been an issue. We have seen in a few of these showpiece battles so far that the attackers applying huge mass to underprepared defences early on has led to them really claiming momentum in fights. That is not the case so far though. Mirkwood Rangers continuing to slice their way through those Eastron crossbowmen. Again though, both units of Mirkwood Rangers going after 1 unit of crossbows.
The enemy's ram has breached the gates.
I do worry that in the long run Mirkwood aren't going to have access to some of these resources that they will sorely need come the late game. There are 2 units of Eastron crossbows, I suppose. 3 units of Rangers. Rangers, in spite of the fact they've lost their body piercing, are known for being effective in this latest patch. They can really punch their way through, especially these weaker units with impunity. But their presence is going to be needed later as well. The Rhovikin phalanx starting to make its way across the river as well. Slingers going to attempt to put this defensive position under pressure. I mean, they're going to have to take things a little bit slower on this side of the battlefield, are the attackers. A few kills on those elven spears inflicted by the crossbows. I don't think Rhun are going to be moving in immediately over here. Indeed they aren't, and indeed they really can't. I would suggest they do have to wait a little bit for a little bit more progress to be made by their allies. I mean, there is a little bit of territorial progress being made through sheer weight of numbers from the attackers over here. But in terms of efficiency, in terms of the sheer amount of kills inflicted, the defenders will still be pretty pleased with how things have gotten underway over here. Woodland Realm Axemen continuing to swing and connect. Elder Council moving forward to offer a little bit more support. Shaken as well. I mean, the drummers are in close enough proximity to be giving their morale boost, which honestly is probably the only reason why, in particular, the Mordor units haven't run for the hills just yet. I mean, as we look up, head our way back over here, Woodland Realm Patrol, looks like they've run out of ammunition, which is something to consider. There's still a unit of Hiri Peng over here, which can be moved more centrally perhaps. Troll Catapult and Dragon's Breath Artillery. I mean, how effective they're going to be when the battle transitions to be entirely within the halls, which at some point I'm sure it will, is anyone's guess. Elder Council on the march forward. Elder Palace Guard still will be slicing their way through these units on the front line with impunity. Another unit of Uruk infantry arriving just to keep this attack going for the slower approach, the attackers. Simply keeping these assaults going. Meanwhile, over on the other side, in many ways a less clear assault to try and deal with, just because they do have the support of the slingers. The crossbows are still trying to do their thing. The hoplons maybe a little bit overextended, but I mean they are strong enough to hold their own, especially against a force of Hiriek, which has already seen a decent amount of damage inflicted on it by those E-strong crossbows. Trying to push their way through to the Mirkwood silencers, who will be more useful for their projectiles against a unit like this, and you can see here the spears trying to force the issue. A tried and tested tactic for attackers. As they start to filter their way through, poking away at the silencers, although the Entwives moving forward. Committal of monstrous infantry like that at the right moment is an important thing. I mean, the Hiriek moving forward and being the instigators in this fight against the hoplons, but still, just like over on the other side, they have taken a bit of damage. So the numbers of the hoplons may very well be enough for them to win this fight now. Certainly no slouches, definitely on the upper end of regular human spears, the Rhovanion hoplons. It's also still the small matter of a little bit of support coming in from the slingers. Some burning buildings, which yes, that will be from the Gnar Rim, who have taken a lot of damage. Again though, that is an indicator that these Mirkwood Rangers are almost exclusively focused on the supporting units over here, and at some point, I mean now the Rangers, I think, moving over to shoot the infantry, and first port of call will probably be these tribal berserkers. Tribal berserkers actually will be one of the more efficient units for dealing with the Entwives, so whether by accident or by design, the Rhovanion are definitely going about this in the right way, in a good structure. The council close. I mean, the Mirkwood silencers also taking hits from the slingers, not really up to the task of taking on something as robust as the tribal berserkers in melee either, so this was always likely to be a potential issue given the slightly shoestring nature of Mirkwood here in the outer settlement. It was just a case of whether they could be as efficient as possible, but I think the clock is definitely ticking for them now. Forward come the Rhovanion nobles as well, seeing an opportunity to be more aggressive here and force the issue. The Rhovanion filtering through and again getting in close melee with the silencers. Phalanx as well, anchoring things in place. Mirkwood Rangers continuing to shoot. There's several good targets now for the Rangers, which is kind of a good thing. It means that they're very unlikely to be wasting their ammunition up there, but it also means they're not going to be able to hit everything, and the infantry is simply too thin on the ground now. Meanwhile, Rhun continuing to bide their time. A few more units from the Eastlings heading across over here, which is all well and good, but eventually I think they're going to have to double back. Maybe evenly spread themselves a little bit more between that side entrance and the main entrance into the halls, but Mirkwood trying to reorganise themselves now. Both units of the Rhovanion nobles being used aggressively, which, considering the general being in one of the tribal units, that was always going to be in the plan for Mr. Sneakman. And the Rhovanion nobles will definitely find themselves well at home at dealing with a spear javelin hybrid unit. Tribal berserkers as well, so a good territory gain this from the Rhovanion, and with that little bit of support from Rhun, they will be able to sustain this under a good amount of pressure. Over here, meanwhile, Entwives getting involved in melee. This is probably a little bit of a unique experience for Mordor. They're usually used to putting opposition factions under the pump by committing stuff like the Olag High, and that tends to wreak havoc among enemy ranks, but this time it's Mirkwood inflicting that fate upon them, although as if on cue the Olag High are here to try and do the same thing. And again, this standard infantry, they are stopped dead in their tracks. It's whether or not, again, that unit of Hiri Pang offering a little bit of range support could make all the difference here. Of course, they're very unlikely to run out of manpower over on this side of the battlefield, but it is in their best interest to try and whittle them down as much as possible ahead of the fight for the interior. And again, these javelins, I think they are firing at the Olak High. I mean, several of them already bloodied. You know, a little bit of friendly fire being inflicted there, as well as hitting the Mirkwood units, but this was always likely to be a bit of a problem. Blackguard of Barad-dûr moving in conjunction with the trolls, the elven factions in general, the lack of numbers, especially the lighter nature of a faction like Mirkwood anyway, does make them susceptible to mass pushes at opportune moments. Entwives very much in the midst of things now. The Realm Axemen. And it isn't a devastating blow, this, because there is Hiri Lang on station, and they could yet scupper Mordor's attempts to push through. I mean, increased aggression is understandable, considering the gains that the Rhovanion have made over on the other side, but even they have also been stopped now. Several units of heavy swordsmen engaging with the Hoplons, and again, more Entwives over on this side, re-engaging. The tribal berserkers do seem to have already had a bit of an impact on them, however. Narrim going after those Hiri Peng. Things a little bit scattered, a little bit fraught. I mean, Mirkwood are holding on for the time being, but a decision probably does need to be made at some point, because the Rhovanion and their runic support do stand a pretty good chance of cutting off any retreat from this side. But you could also make the argument that everything that's committed over here could be left as a rear guard, but Elder Palace Guard? Is this the sort of thing you want to be losing early? If nothing else, though, the Blackguard of Barad-dûr will probably not be in a condition to do this again, so we'll have to rely on other mass-pushing units. I mean, there's the Blackwatch Legion from Angmar, of course. Haven't seen too much of Angmar. Orc-fellas have been on the front line for a little bit. Their axes trying to impact on the Entwives, and they have had a good effect, to be fair. Elder Council trying to get into a position to support 2 units of javelins with a bit of crossfire. Trolls going to make short work, you would suggest. I mean, Rangers trying to get on the front line. They can be pretty good against regular infantry as a little bit of a supporting unit, but they're not going to be able to deal the kind of damage against trolls that will be necessary to bring them down in any kind of hurry. Palace Guard would, though. Blackguard of Barad-dûr starting to fall away now. The support of the Angmar Halberds, probably the best time to commit them as well, when they're going to be at their most effective. Several of them starting to fall away now, mind you. Troll Catapult. Do they have the angle? They could try and bank a shot into the Elder Palace Guard. Missing carries with it a bit of a high price, though. You could hit the centre mass of your own units. Are Mirkwood able to keep... I mean, they kind of need to... If they intend to hold one side, they need to be able to hold both. Again, all of these Mirkwood Rangers. Time will tell whether all of that ammunition was well spent from these Rangers, I suppose, considering they're now all being used as auxiliary melee units on the front line. I mean... a look over here, there is a good amount of dead over on this side of the river, but another unit of Woodland Realm Patrol continuing to fire their missiles into the backs of this position. I mean, this is the benefit of these elven walkways. You can fire equally from both sides. It is a little bit more exposed as a result of that. It is a good opportunity to shoot into the backs of all of these units. I mean, in particular, going after the back of the Rhovikin phalanx might be the play here. You need to try and deal with all of these pole arms somehow, and like I said, Mirkwood's way of doing that is with their missiles. Rhovikin nobles taking ever more damage, it must be said, but continuing to act as the centre point of this offensive action. Tribal levy slingers getting into a good position to hit the side of this front line as well. More of these Rangers falling. Oof. That was the plan, was it? The artillery getting into a position to hit the other side. Getting some good hits as well. They did get some friendly fire, but far more of that was hits on the elves. Ooh, That was friendly fire, however. A bit unfortunate. Going through the tribal levy slingers. And actually, as a result of that, it does look as though this attack is now crumbling, which is a shame. Definitely worth going after there. The double-edged sword of artillery, but definitely. I mean, is that the dragon's breath? No, it is the troll catapult. But look at all of these trolls now. As much as that attack has started to fall apart, the mass push has started to really bite. Barrow Wights, trolls, Great Shield infantry. Potent combination, Angmar and Mordor, when they can get their ducks in a row like this. Mirkwood Rangers still just about alive, but yeah, this is going to be the moment where Mirkwood are forced into retreat. And indeed, that is what they are doing. Probably going to need to retreat all the way to the halls as well. Try and do some final javelin volleys. To be fair, one of the Olag Hide do fall as a result of that. Some orc fodder getting up into the faces of the Elder Council. Now is probably the time to try and retreat these Elder Council, though, if you do intend to get them back to safety, which you should if they've still got ammunition. These trolls really want to, after all, they could. I think that's probably Eclipse's general, based on the fact that his palace guard were over there. I don't know, really. I mean, in terms of who will be happier with that, probably the attackers. 5v3s mean the defenders need to be getting huge returns from most of their fights, and that wasn't terrible, but it wasn't amazing by any stretch of the imagination. Narim on the way forward with all of the tribal units around them. And the Rhovanion have taken a bit of a beating getting to this point, which again is not too surprising. They don't have the benefit of 3 armies like they did on the other side, and Rhun couldn't afford to send their entire army in support purely because of the necessity of leaving at least a portion of their army over here. Speaking of which, I thought they were going to send over some support for that side door, but it's not. It's just fleeing Rhovanion units. Claiming the outer settlement here. Retreating in stages. 5 Rhovican nobles remain. The kiting backwards actually of the javelins has been pretty good. I mean, yeah, I did think, you know, these archers be interesting to see if they do manage to retreat, but that is definitely not going to be the case now. Trolls of Angmar going to finish them off. I don't know if they had any ammunition left per se, but every elf is going to count when it comes for the struggle for the interior, so anything the attackers can do to limit the defenders' manpower going to be key. Or javelins on the way forwards. So these tribal units as well, slingers, Balkoth tribesmen, lots of thrown projectiles. Ah yes, this I think is the indicator that the map is not fully finished, because you can see that they are going to be able to shoot through this structure, I would assume. This Mirkwood building. This is probably the 5% unfinished that Eclipse mentioned, but not the end of the world. It just kind of depends on how sporting the attackers are willing to be in terms of taking advantage of that. We do still need to get through the gate after all to actually gain entryway to the settlement. Anyway, Beasts of Gorgoroth moving forward, just trying to crush what little remains of the elven resistance outside of the gates underfoot quickly. Though to be fair, actually, a few of them dying off. One of them dying off at the very least, bloodied. As I said, they aren't trolls, they aren't really designed to just stand in melee for extended periods. You do want to keep units like that moving. Come the orc fodder, Lang routing, being left outside of the gates to perish. I mean, this, recalling the old version of Thranduil's halls, it was always the bit just in the gate that was the most effective defensive position that the elves could make use of, and that is still the case here. It's maybe a little bit, you're going to have to position your archers a little bit more cleverly. I mean, you can, of course, pack those positions on the walkway up to the throne with archers, which is all well and good, but you're going to want maximum archer coverage for what is to come. And it's definitely going to be this front gate where pretty much the bulk of the threat is going to be coming from. You will need to, of course, partition off a bit of an army for dealing with Infinity's runic force as well, but much less manpower over here, and also don't have access to the huge mass that the Great Shield Infantry, the Trolls and the Beasts offer the attackers from the front entrance. Which means you're going to have to front load things over here unless you want to get forced out of the way, as can often be the case. Lang waiting. What is going on here? It's going to be a times 6 job now, as we wait for presumably a ram to make its way forwards. Some of the stray artillery shots did clatter into the gate, so it is damaged already, but I guess I don't want to use up too much of their ammunition, because the Dragon's Breath and the catapult could be useful if they manage to secure a bit of a beachhead inside of the gates. After all, just having a little look inside, I mean, this is, technically speaking, the highest bit of terrain, or joint highest bit of terrain, along with the town centre section over there, that is on the inside of the settlement, so artillery could be really useful if they manage to situate themselves nicely. See that WK, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he's going after the reinforced gates as opposed to trying to take advantage of the fact that you can shoot through this structure. Still the catapults. Presumably has a bit of ammunition as well. The Trolls themselves, of course, as part of the crew, could be very useful in the extreme late game as well. The fact that the reinforced gates are not losing any more, it's not losing any more durability, makes me question. Ah, there we go. Saving them from trying to. It is a. I guess it's the perfect excuse, though, really, isn't it? We left all our rams way too far away, so we're going to use our artillery. Any additional hits we score on your infantry, purely an accident, of course. They have taken extra damage in. Nothing too important, to be fair, but Mirkwood do need all of the help they can get in a 5v3 like this. Right. Now then. Rhun the ones in first, interestingly enough, the Flag Rim. Bunching up into a dense formation now, the Woodland Realm Axemen, denying them passage. Further back, more of the Axemen as well, some out of ammunition Woodland Realm patrol. Of course, what would be a really strong defensive position here at the gate is less so because of the flimsy nature of those walls, so I would actually suggest that maybe Mirkwood, instead of continuing to commit units forward, it may look amazing as a result of it being a narrow choke point, but it may be better off for you to retreat to this section here. You then have the benefit of being able to use your archers a little bit further back more freely. It does establish a bit more of a beachhead for the attackers, which you may want to avoid, but in the long run I think giving you a better choice of target and not being subject to the one flaw in the map is probably more useful from an elven perspective, but just filtering in that weight of numbers. Angmar Halberds moving in to try and help anchor things in place against the more lightweight and basic Mirkwood troops. What they do next, Carmel's Immortals making their way in, so Infinity going to start the attack over here with the Realm Axemen are there. I mean, they're certainly going to need more than this. Maybe a little early to be committing the entirety of a runic army like this, but why not? 5v3, you can afford to throw caution to the wind a little bit more. Make things a bit more interesting. The Realm Axemen closing in from the side, Scion Rim of course. Mentioned their merits in the deployment phase as well, being that strong defensive bulwark of all of the runic infantry. So they start to push their way forwards. Mirkwood silencers. In a good position actually. They're throwing projectiles. Of course, assassins have got a relatively linear projectile. A good opportunity for them to get maximum efficiency here. I think it's important for Mirkwood to get a really solid victory against this attack from Infinity, honestly. If they aren't able to score that, I don't know. Don't really fancy their chances going further into the battle, honestly. Back, the Angmar halberds starting to filter in. Gamprim closing up. Hiriek be the strongest of the Mirkwood frontline troops. I mean, more Elder Palace Guard. Like we mentioned, there are several units of Palace Guard. I don't know if this is necessarily a good idea. Adin sending in his Angmar halberds, trying to force them in, but I mean, this will allow them to get situated, but that initial burst of damage that they will receive at the hands of these Woodland Realm Axemen will be pretty significant. Javelins, I mean, they're going to really try and push here now. Support from the Angmar over on this side will lend more credence to this attack, and Blackwatch Legion as well. Javelins on both sides. I mean, reinforcements from this side are probably going to be less forthcoming, just because they'll be a little bit more worried perhaps about this frontal position. ELVENKINGS Guard? I haven't noticed any of them use up any of their ammunition yet. Maybe they were outside. And if they haven't used their ammunition, the armor piercing in melee is nice, but you really want to be using all the arrows first and foremost, so I'm sure that the defenders not committing archers with full ammunition. Barrow-wights will keep this attack going for longer, but actually it is over here where there will be more urgency, just because of the Great Shield Infantry and the Trolls acting in tandem again. I know that people don't like this tactic, and I will be honest, I've soured on it a little bit as well. We see it every single time. The elves. I mean, the elves need to be able to deal enough damage to be able to stop such a thing. And that was definitely not the case there. Blowing through that defensive position. Mirkwood silencers, Elder Council ready and waiting. Palace Guard over on this side with the Hiriek. They are going to be able to keep the attackers in check for the time being, but are we going to see some hits from the archers back here? Now the Royal Council in a good position. They are sending over a unit of Hiri Lang, but I mean the problem with this is you can send over a unit in response, but you need more than that when someone's mass pushing. One unit is not going to suffice, otherwise you're just going to suffer the same consequences, especially when they're being backed up by trolls. Just because the damage trolls can do to a scattered unit is very, very significant. You can see here the Blackwatch Legion, obviously from the front, those shields helping them greatly against the Elder Royal Council. Not many units would be able to withstand point-blank volleys as well as they just did, but the Blackwatch Legion in melee, ironically enough, once they do get to melee, will get ripped apart by the Royal Council, so that will be the end of the Great Shield Infantry. And the Trolls of Angmar, isolated against a fairly healthy unit of Hiri Lang, means they're probably going to fall by the wayside as well, but Mirkwood Silence is actually able to close over any sort of retreat also. So the Scion Rim not going to be able to go backwards, so this attack ultimately has failed. Which is heartening to see. I was worried that we would see that tactic work for like the 5th time in a row, but on this occasion, no. The attackers did not have the committed units to be able to sustain it. Balance of forces evenly matched, flag rim. Continuing to fight on the front line, but fight a losing battle for now. Palace Guard still here in high enough numbers. If the attackers are to have more luck here, they're going to have to hope those halberdiers manage to situate themselves nicely. Because if they can, the relative quality of Mirkwood is going to start to bite them. More axemen as well, being used to good effect. Trolls pushing forward, but I mean the trolls getting away from the Hiri Lang only to go into the Elder Royal Council is not going to save them. Laying a unit of trolls low is always a good thing for defenders to see as well. Speaking of which, small matter of the Olag High, who are, you know, fairly battered and bruised, and you can see one of them falling as soon as we arrive. Carmel's chosen from WK in close attendance as well. This is where those two-handed axes will really start to earn their keep as well. The most heavily armoured of the runic units, in addition to the Mordor infantry that's on the front line, all will be susceptible to the bite of those axes. Troll drummers in close proximity means that routing, at the very least for the attackers, is not really going to be on the agenda anytime soon. Plenty of Mirkwood reinforcements for now. Of course, there will be plenty more attacking reinforcements, it's just whether or not they're able to take full advantage of that. More and more units have been sent around over here to try and also go through this side entrance. This very thin line of Mirkwood silence is not able to stop the beasts of Gorgoroth, but they do still represent a fairly solid front line in the grand scheme of things. It's not a complete territory gain yet, this pathway up. They are continuing to send more and more units in. That will be the other unit of Elder Royal Council firing at that unit of Gamprim, trying to do as much damage as they possibly can. These beasts of Gorgoroth starting to fall away. Hiri Lang once again. I mean, every time they come into contact with the Hiri Lang, there's also Hiri Ek, which would have been the main issue there. Elephant class units, of course, are susceptible to anti-cavalry bonuses, something which those Elven Spears can very much provide. The Flag Rim routing, the Gamp Rim on the verge of routing. Still a lot of enemy units down there, but heartening signs for Mirkwood. It's just whether or not they can keep their defensive lines strong enough. You can see once again the attackers trying to force their way through, an ever-dwindling number on the front line. Elder Council repositioning themselves to slam the door shut in the Flag Rim's face. I mean, I can appreciate what Infinity's trying to do here, but I think on this occasion things are starting to look a little bit ropey for the attackers over on this side. And if they only have to focus on one defensive position, that will be to Mirkwood's great benefit, but the Black Guard of Barad-dûr pushing through over here, and mass pushing once again. We've seen it fail once in a roundabout kind of way in this battle, but twice now we've seen it succeed, paying great dividends. Elder Royal Council looping their shots, which can be scarcely afforded at this point in time. I think the attackers are going to have too much left in the tank, honestly, for the defenders. Valiant efforts across the field, but... and now the Witches as well. If they add their own damage to proceedings... oof. This amount of units, the interior of the settlement seems to be struggling a little bit. Simon, victory seems certain. That's surprising. There's Black Guard of Barad-dûr. Yeah, that's not good. Like I said, the Witches, only one or two volleys can be the sort of thing in a 5v3 to really tip the scales. Mirkwood forcing the enemy outside of the settlement once again over here. I mean, there's Witchram Hammerguard over on this side of things, which do muddy the waters somewhat, but at this point Mirkwood kind of need to get a shimmy on. They need to win this fight comprehensively enough and then send reinforcements up to the front end over there. Otherwise they're going to end up overwhelmed, and by the time they get around to sending reinforcements it's already going to be too late. Some looped projectiles sending in here. They are getting kills, but it's not on anything that important in the grand scheme. Orc javelins, Orc infantry on the front line. Eerie Lang. Lot of dead Mirkwood silencers this. Witchers and now slingers going about their grisly work. Going to retreat potentially to the town centre, but I mean it's not the most natural of final stands, but we'll have to wait and see if it will suffice. Defeat is a distinct possibility, defeat seems certain. Unsurprisingly, given the numbers discrepancies that are involved here. Eerie Lang loitering on the front line. Flag rim. Yeah, and the elves they're gonna have to try and consolidate at this point. The opportunity to send reinforcements has passed. Considering the quality of the Hammer Guard, they would need to commit something pretty substantial. And there goes Infinity's general. That is something. The spears are not retreating quickly enough though. Walking in formation, and as a result they're going to end up crushed beneath the blows of the Hammer Guard. Here's where the general is as well. They've got a fair distance to hotfoot it. The attackers. Yeah, ELVENKINGS Guard. Decent angle of fire here into the Gamp Rim. Returning fire from the Gnar Rim. Going after the ELVENKINGS Guard. Again, a good firing position those, but a little bit exposed. It's kind of the point though, because I mean, defending archers, very often your own fortifications can get in the way of the firing angle because of the way Medieval 2 works. So if they are a little bit more exposed like that, it actually makes it easier for the defenders to be able to get the angle they want in order to fire effectively, but it also means of course the attackers can return fire relatively easily as we march more or less to the final 10,000 frames. I would be surprised if the attackers don't go on to win from here. Late game elves, provided they have the quality, can be a force to turn things around, but I think the numbers they have at their disposal will probably make that very, very tricky. Actually setting up another defensive position over here, which is interesting, as the column of attackers gets closer to them. Not a huge force, you'd have to say. Haven't seen the rest of the artillery just yet either, from an attacking perspective. Speaking of which, the Dragon's Breath is here. The Troll Catapult is also in attendance. Whether they can actually get the angle though, artillery can be pretty finicky when you're in enclosed spaces like this. Hiriak routing. Little remains of the elves on the front line. They are still fighting, but they are shaken. Again, Blackguard and Barad-dûr. Fighting as more traditional infantry now, just in order to make sure the numbers are topped up. Guard taking hits from the Gnar Rim still. Don't right things. The attackers. Not everything they've done has paid off, but everything has been pretty by the book for a 5v3. Elves marching forward in an attempt to meet the attackers, but again the Hammer Guard being at the centre of things here is going to make things a bit more complicated for the elves. It means they can't rely on having the numbers advantage or the quality advantage. Numbers advantage definitely the attackers can rely on. Scion Rim with Gamp Rim, it's a good front line, and Palace Guard getting caught on the front of those halberdiers would not be great. Do the Elder Council have the angle to be able to offer the support that they need to? Elder Royal Council are down here. Carmel's Chosen are on the way. Another bodyguard tier unit. The Elder Royal Council are going after a unit that is a little bit more vulnerable in the Shadow Guard. Those axes, armour piercing to armour piercing, but Hammer Guard, one of the very best units in this niche that the game has to offer. The Elvenking's Guard, it's merely their secondary weapon. Caught. Try and bunch up with the Elder Council on the front line as well. More and more reinforcements on the way down here as well, so they're unlikely to run out of juice anytime soon. The elves do have reinforcements they can commit down here also, however. So we'll see if this pays off for them. As the attackers start to bear down on the town centre, but more units still available. Look at this. Yep. Perfect angle acquired. I think that's the troll catapult. They had a good firing position, but yeah, the artillery. Now they've established a position inside the settlement. It's always going to be one of the potential outcomes. Another little flashpoint in the battle where you think, yeah, the attackers probably do have this. The elves have enough left where you wouldn't be wanting to bet too much on that at this point in time, but the odds are lengthening. Tribal Levy Slingers, once again doing their thing, just bits and pieces of damage of course that attacking skirmishers can often get away with inflicting, especially against lower numbers factions like Mirkwood. Remains of the trolls getting committed. Will they finally be brought down? Palace Guard having to be very aggressive here, in behind enemy lines with the Elvenking's Guard. Going after all of these projectile units, Orc Javelins, wanting to prevent them from doing their thing, but stand and shoot, the sort of thing which the attackers can very much get away with now. Bouncing projectiles, so that was probably the Dragon's Breath, wherever that may be. Over in the Conquered section of the halls. Only one, oh, I thought that was going to be the death animation there, but still two of the trolls remain. Again, the problem that they have is they still have the high quality units here, the attackers. So Temple Executioners are going to be in and amongst all of these projectile units. It's not the sort of thing I think the defenders have too many answers for at this point. Carmel's Chosen. Oof, that was the Dragon's Breath as well, I think. Indeed it is. In a pretty good position as we get stuck in the roof. One thing that is worth mentioning though, the Trail Hammer Guard are a little bit thinner on the ground now, only 19 of them remain. I mean, the Elvenking's Guard will do a decent amount of damage in response, of course. I don't think it's going to be enough in the long run. Carmel's Chosen in close attendance as well. Elder Palace Guard victory seems certain with only 23 of them, which is impressive against Gamp Rim, Scion Rim, and now Sapphire Bladesman as well. Higher tier Javelins, I mean of course it may say victory seems certain, but we know that it is anything but. Even the Palace Guard will probably not be able to dig out even a consolidation victory over here. Support from the Javelins as well. Going after some of the units just in behind the Elven line. Royal Council, only 25 of them remain, 41. They'll do a decent amount of damage on the way through, but again, the attackers will have enough in terms of numbers to be able to overcome, you would suggest. Ballooning the Javelins high and going after the Elder Royal Council. Sapphire Bladesmen forcing their way through. Again, forcing the issue is something which the attackers will often do in a 5v3. Oof. The Elder Royal Council getting burnt to a crisp by the Dragon's Breath. Mirkwood Silencers have been a pretty good unit though. I mean, often assassin class units can be a little bit more tricky to use, but they have been one of the better performing Mirkwood units today. It's a slightly strange shaped settlement to defend, especially on the interior. But that is by far the source of blame for the defenders' loss here, I think. Troll catapult crew now being used as a bludgeon. Ammunition perhaps all gone. Really is just a case of how many they can take down with them at this point, the elves, which probably won't be insubstantial. Having a look. It is within the 10% boundary, quite a long way within the 10% boundary actually. 6% the difference for the time being. That will probably... well, it might contract a little bit actually, considering there are still quite a few Palace Guards still remaining. ELVENKINGS Guard as well, capable of dishing out damage quickly. Pretty much all the reinforcements have been committed as well, so I mean... well... the Troll Catapult crew, Dragon's Breath crew... I suppose not all is lost for the elves, maybe pulling out a victory over here if the Palace Guard and Elder Royal Council are able. Oh yeah, but then of course there's the small matter of these guys. As soon as maybe a glimmer of hope was starting to present itself, the Witchers slap it back down in the ways that they often do. Not quite as ridiculous as they once were, but still. Another defending general falls. Mirkwood. We have seen a bit of routing in completely hopeless engagements from the elves in this battle, and there is of course a small matter of this continuing advance from the attackers. Defenders will have to split their attentions. Continuing to throw their slings. Council standing to attention. Still artillery with a bit of ammunition as well, so even with all the expertise on the front line, the Palace Guard and the Royal Council, there's always an impossibility if we're being serious. All three instances of Thranduil have also now been slain. One by one, requirements for victory being met. Only a unit of 27 Mirkwood Silencers in the way of that attacking column. I go Sin's general though. Mordor's general falling away. Still 3 of the attacking armies do have their generals, however. Elder Council scurrying away. Comes the other Troll Catapult crew now, also out of ammunition. Of course nowhere near the devastating force that the Olag High are, but they can still be a bit of a menace on the front line. Angmar General falls. At this point it's just the Rhovanion general and one of the two runic generals that still stand of all the army leaders. By battle's end maybe only one will remain to sit upon Thranduil's old throne. Otherwise they will have to duke it out. Although I'm sure in terms of seniority I suppose it would be the runic general that would lay claim to it. Angmar Marauders still alive in the late game, but some more numerous units being committed. So this is the only instance now. Well, there goes a general. That was the tribal unit as well, so I assume that was the Rhovanion general. This is now the only engagement, so times 2 speed it shall be. And it is, to be fair, Elder Royal Council that do remain. This, I mean, it is going to be exactly 10% in the end, and you can see how many units remain for the attackers, and that is 10% of the army. Gives you an idea of how much 100% must have looked like at the start if they were all lined up on the same side of the settlement. It is an intimidating force. I mean, 5v3s have always been pretty damn difficult for the defenders, as it is proven here. But there we go. And in terms of what could the defenders have done differently, I mean, too many of the engagements, I think, ended up with them also taking damage from supporting attacking units, be it crossbows or slingers or witches at the most extreme. I mean, like we said, it is more, the good firing positions on this map are a little bit more exposed, so there is a limited amount that you're going to be able to do about that. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those, isn't it? It's a case of a complete overhaul in terms of choice of targets and choice of defensive positions, and more we're seeing that the defenders in these situations need to be able to quickly commit a huge amount of units to a defensive position, otherwise the attackers will mass push you. They will use Great Shield Infantry and they will back it up with trolls, and if that's the case, that is a really difficult thing to counteract. If anything, I would say that in order to be able to do that, it should be a huge financial commitment for the attackers. I think probably what needs to happen is Great Shield Infantry needs to be made very expensive, just because we see this every single time now, and it's starting to get a bit predictable. Yeah, that would probably be my balance recommendation, just based on the battles that I've seen. But yeah, I mean, it is what it is, I suppose. As far as the attackers go, no real complaints there. They did everything pretty much by the book. Not everything they did worked, but you know, they were willing to try different things. Most of it was based, you know, most of the good things they did were based around high mass units and forcing the issue, like I said. And obviously that ended up working. Mr. Sneakman got the least amount of kills, but I think his early game work was instrumental in quickly dealing with more quickly dealing with the outer settlement than they otherwise would have been able to. Obviously Mordor and Angmar, devastating duo as we saw because of the high mass and mass pushing units that they do have, and Rhun with their more balanced approach also helping out with things. So what did the damage for Mirkwood? Elder Palace Guard, early commitment from them, 643 kills, no complaints. Hiri Pen getting 0 kills is pretty unacceptable. If you're in a 5v3, none of your units can be getting 0 kills. 56 and 38 is also not good for a unit of spears. I mean, you need to be getting at least 100 kills, really, on each of your units when you're playing as the elves. Otherwise, something's gone badly wrong. ELVENKINGS Guard did okay, but again, that's the amount of kills I would be expecting from their bows, and then add on some more from their axes. 300 kills from Rangers is a good return, 185 maybe not so much. I mean, it's high stakes this. You need to be getting, high numbers from most of your units in a 5v3, especially as the elves, so it's higher standards. Elder Royal Council, again, Palace Guard 87, that's not enough, not by a long way. Hiriak, so you can see certain units have just vastly underperformed, and this is where the elves started to struggle, because if they had performed to standard, this would have been a bit of a nail-biter. Again, ELVENKINGS Guard 102 isn't really enough either, 214 is a bit more like it, 136 in the Royal Council. I mean, late on, to be fair, so by that point, probably a bit too much to ask. Hiri Lang, 418. I mean, Elder Palace Guard over here, 780. Does go to show how devastating the Palace Guard can be as a melee unit when they're at their best. But yeah, so you can see some units underperforming there for the elves. Some ranged, some melee, a mix of the two. But, I mean, we were here to see a showcase of this new map, and it's definitely a big improvement on the old Thranduil's Halls. I think the old Thranduil's Halls was very linear in the way that it would work out. One choke point at the front, one choke point at the base, at the front of the halls themselves as well, and that was how it worked out every single time. Whereas this time, there's always more than one way for the battle to progress. More than one choke point, which is necessary for an interesting siege map, and that is definitely the case here. So yeah, good to see another showpiece map. Big thank you to Eclipse for sending this one in and allowing me to show it. Big thank you to all the players for being a part of this battle replay as well. As far as what's coming up next, I have temporarily at the very least run my battle replay supply on the test build dry, although there's always more of those in the pipeline, I'm sure. I think the only map that I know that I haven't shown off yet, which I know is new, is Tharbad. There may be a couple of others as well, but that's the only one that I can say with 100% certainty is in the game. So we'll see if we show that one before or after release of the new patch. But one thing that I will certainly be able to do is actually a larger scale siege on Silmarillion. So depending on what happens within the next while, that will be the next weekend slot battle that we see. But things can always move around, like I said. So yeah, big thanks to all the players once again. Hope you enjoyed this, and hope you'll join me for whatever is next.